Good morning. So I woke up early enough and had enough energy that I felt like recording a video this morning. Been enjoying this. And these have been getting quite a lot of views, so figured I might as well keep doing them, whenever I'm able to and up for it. So I titled this stream "What is Socialism?" because yesterday a friend of mine who had seen you know these videos and other things I'd been posting, who just doesn't really know anything about the subject, kind of just oblivious to it, maybe mercifully, um, just kind of asked me that question straightforwardly, naively, and I felt a little bit felt unsure of how to answer. There's of course a lot of kind of simple one sentence or even um, you know short phrase answers that you could give, that people tend to give to that question. Um, I don't really like that approach, at least not right now, given the state that socialism as a political project, or even just as a philosophy or vision for the future, so to speak, is in. I find it to be quite a difficult question to answer because, as I've said previously, what socialism means today, what people tend to mean by that word today when they use it, not just socialists themselves, people that identify with the term and are proponents of it, which, that group in and of itself encompasses a pretty large spectrum of different positions that don't necessarily agree amongst themselves. Everyone from, you know, internet wackos of various stripes, to sectarian groups left over from the 60s and 70s that are still kicking around. There's, of course, DSA, there's Bernie Sanders. I don't know if the Squad calls themselves socialist. I don't think they do, but they certainly get called that by a lot of their supporters. And I don't think there are a huge number of socialists out there. I know there's been some polls in recent years that have indicated that young people are more inclined to be supportive of socialism and opposed to capitalism than previous generations, but I don't think that's necessarily indicative of anything other than their own confusion, the confusion of the people answering that poll, because I don't think most of them would be able to give a meaningful response to that question, what is socialism? One that accounts for the legacy of socialism, the tradition of socialism as an intellectual and political project. I think it's more likely that they were responding based on the prompt of the pollster, or the kind of vague associations they have with the term based on the way it's thrown around in popular discourse. And of course, I would say probably more likely the opponents of socialism, the people that use that term today as a slur or a term of derision, are, if anything, more dominant in the popular discourse around the term. I think they're probably greater in number, and for that matter, a lot of the people that sympathize with the term and might even, respond to a poll affirming it, the way they think about that term is really determined by the mainstream use of it as a kind of scare word. You know, it signifies something that we had better be wary of, something dangerous, something to be avoided or criticized. And, you know, it's hard to answer that question from someone without some kind of education in the history of socialism. Because more likely than not, they're going to, you know, draw upon associations that are current, but that, in my opinion, represent really the antithesis of what the term used to mean, what it meant to the people that made socialism into a meaningful social and historical phenomenon, you know, over the period from, say, the early 19th century when socialism emerged as an idea and as a movement to the early 20th century, so about a century or so. From, if you'd like, you could date it from roughly 1817 to 1917. It's a little neat, but I believe 1817 was the year that Robert Owen, who was the founder of the kind of first school of socialism, it was the year that he announced his new vision for society, his new system of society, that would kind of develop and transform into a variety of different forms, but that would kind of become the socialism that became a mass phenomenon, a mass movement of working class people throughout Europe and throughout the world. And then, of course, 1917, the year of the Russian Revolution, which unfortunately marked, it seemed at the time to mark the potential triumph of socialism in the face of what seemed like its catastrophic and inevitable destruction. It was kind of it seemed like a last gasp for a dying movement that gave it a new birth of life. But tragically, it didn't really pan out that way. To the extent that the Russian Revolution did mark a kind of rebirth for socialism, beyond its crisis and, you know, destruction during World War One. It did kind of give socialism a rebirth, but it was a kind of a monstrous rebirth. So, you know, I'll say more about that another time. I don't want to ramble too much now, because I don't feel like I'm really answering the question, and I wouldn't want to show my friend this video, what I'm recording right now, because I don't think it would clarify anything. I think it would just be confusing. Certainly some of you who might be watching this who are more sensitive to this history, who have a little bit more background here, might kind of get the gist of what I'm saying. But the point I'm trying to make is essentially that, you know, socialism was a phenomenon that existed for about a century, from the early 18th to the from the early 19th century to the early 20th century. And then over the last century, from the early 20th century to now, the early 21st, it has decayed, degenerated, regressed. It and has kind of ended up not only a shell of its former self, but really it means almost the exact opposite of what it formerly meant. And that's kind of a difficult thing to reckon with if you have high regard for the old socialist legacy, the legacy of the old socialist movement from a century ago or more, from the 19th into the early 20th century, because you can't really say you're a socialist without being misunderstood, without being identified with not that tradition, that movement, that idea that you find so important and worth reviving and reclaiming. You're rather identified with this kind of grotesque, monstrous inversion of that idea that resulted from its crisis and its inability to resolve that crisis, its ultimate failure, and the kind of distortion and degradation that resulted from it, from a century of failure. So that's, it's a difficult question to answer. And I kind of felt like I wanted to just give it a shot trying to answer that question. I don't think I can do it in a sentence. It would probably be a little bit more involved than that. But I could sit down and try to write a response, but, and, I feel pretty confident. I've actually taken kind of stabs at this before. And, I'm sure I will again. But I want to be able to respond to that question spontaneously in a way that won't overwhelm the person asking me with, a huge story that kind of tests their patience and their willingness to converse. um, it would be great if I could just sit someone down and give them a history lesson on the subject, but that's not necessarily always possible. When you're answering this question, what is socialism? You're not only giving an answer to the question in the sense of explaining what socialism meant to the old socialist movement, to the old, in its old, older form before its decline and degeneration in the 20th century. You have to kind of explain why it doesn't mean that anymore, why it changed, and whether or not that change is irreversible, if it's possible to reclaim that term, to transform its meaning again, to undo the degradation that it suffered, or otherwise to overcome it. And when I make that point, often people will respond by saying, well, why don't you just come up with a new term? And because that other term, socialism, is so loaded with these, unfortunate associations and connotations, why don't you just come up with a new term that doesn't have those associations? And I don't think it's that simple because, sure, you could do that, but if you're talking about the same thing, the associations are going to come back, whether or not you're using the term. And, you're going to get called a socialist just by virtue of invoking some tropes that are associated with that term and with its history. But also, more importantly, I think, socialism will never reemerge as a meaningful political force in the world, let alone the kind of basis for a historical transformation of society. If, people en masse, large numbers of people, ultimately the vast majority of people, if not all people, reckon with this history, become conscious of the history that made the world they live in what it is, that made them what they are, that makes the problems they face problems for them. They have to be able to reckon with that history, to make sense of it, to see their place in it, to understand how things got this way, how the past changed into the present that they face, and how those forces of change, those forces of historical transformation, acting on the world, constituting the present from out of the past, and continuing to act on the present, transforming it, but also allowing it to preserve itself over time through change, through transformation. They have to reckon with those forces of change. They have to reckon with their own activity, their own involvement in the world, their own lives as elements of those forces of change, as part of those forces of change. They have to reckon with that. They have to make sense of themselves as part of this long unfolding process, and they have to understand that process in its nuance, in its detail, to such an extent that they render that process conscious. They render their role in that process conscious. They understand what they do with their lives, not as consequential only for them or their loved ones or the people they associate with, in their day-to-day lives, but consequential for the history of humanity, the history of the world, consequential for the future of humanity. That's difficult to think about. I mean, it's easy to, invoke that notion as a generality, but then you kind of have to push it aside when you go back to work, or you go back to living life, to taking care of your children, or going shopping. You can't think about that all the time. But that's what socialism meant in the past, in the old sense. It meant raising the consciousness of regular working people to the peak in which they would understand their role in the unfolding of history, in the transformation of society from one phase of historical development to a new phase, to a new dawning of potential for the human race, a new birth of freedom beyond the limitations that currently constrain us and that currently define the world that we live in, the lives that we lead. It's the notion that these constraints are being pushed to their limits, and that kind of appears to us in the form of all of the various crisis-ridden aspects of our world. All the senses in which the world we live in seem wrong, it seems wrong. It seems like there's something irrational about it. Like things don't really make sense. Like there's something. It makes sense, but it doesn't. It shouldn't be this way, but of course it's this way. I don't know about you. I mean, I feel that way on a day-to-day basis. And I think a lot of people feel that, even if they don't think about it necessarily, or even if they do think about it, they can't really take that thought very far because they don't have the context to make sense of this strange character of our world as kind of in constant crisis, in a constant state of, pointing towards something else, but not able to bring it about spontaneously, just naturally of its own accord. People need to understand why that is the case, how they play a role in the world having that character, and how they could play a role in the transformation that the world feels pregnant with, but that doesn't seem to be achievable, that seems utopian or fantastical. unrealistic, idealistic. Um, yeah, so I don't think you can just discard socialism so easily, because if you're awakening people to the historical process that gave birth to their world and that made them what they are and that defines the problems they struggle with on a day-to-day basis, let alone on a kind of aggregate scale of the problems facing society as a whole, um, they're going to have to reckon with the history of socialism, even if they don't, even if that reckoning is conducted under some other terminology, even if you're providing this education to people under some other auspices, if it's serious, if it's really taking into account the 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 broad historical processes that created our world, then not only do you have to deal with the socialist tradition and its failure and the catastrophe that resulted from it, namely the 20th century, this century of, this apocalyptic century that just passed, this real dystopia that the world is not emerging from exactly, but kind of accommodating itself to now, kind of naturalizing, but that you know for at least a few decades felt pretty horrifying to a lot of people in the world, and that even more horrifyingly, a lot of people didn't seem phased by it at all. um, People are going to have to reckon with that legacy one way or another, no matter what you call yourself. Call yourself whatever you want. If you want them to reckon with it, not only to think about it, but to actually become an active, conscious force negotiating the process of change that's already unfolding, with a determinate intention, with an intention to overcome the limitations that, rather than transcending, we keep reproducing in ever more kind of haphazard and unstable forms. Anyway, I'm not really answering the question, what is socialism right now, in anything like a concise or approachable manner, and I didn't really think I would. It's early and I'm just kind of giving some general thoughts on that question and how I would want to approach it when posed that question by someone who doesn't really have any background in the subject and maybe doesn't even have any really clearly defined political affiliations or you know feelings. So yeah, I don't know. I might try to get to that question later in this stream. I'll probably go for maybe another half an hour or so. It would be great to be able to answer that question in a few sentences, or probably a little more than that maybe, but within the span of a conversation that doesn't take more than a few minutes. And I think I probably could if someone was patient enough to let me try, but there are people that you don't want to alienate by overwhelming them with information that they didn't necessarily know they were asking for. So part of this project, this Socialist Legacy project, is, part of it is based on my own interest and curiosity in the legacy of socialism, the old socialist movement, in digging through the materials, the literary records of that tradition, to find illuminating elements. Because, there are the tried and true things that everyone who knows anything about socialism reads. They read the Communist Manifesto, and they read The State and Revolution by Lenin, and there's various other holy texts, and those are two in particular are, I think, excellent and very important texts. Of course, I'm not trying to minimize their importance, but unfortunately, I think a lot of people fixate not on the self-understanding that this tradition had, not its own understanding of itself, but this kind of caricatured understanding that emerged in the mid to late 20th century. Has its roots in the earlier 20th century, in say the 30s and 40s, but really kind of becomes all encompassing and naturalized by the 60s and 70s, and now it's just, now it's just so identified with the term that it's just what it means for a lot of people, pro or con, pro socialist or anti socialist. They all have this, if you will, this kind of Stalinist understanding of socialism as where essentially what you do is you take whatever aspects of the socialist tradition are convenient and you use them to rationalize whatever accommodation you've made to the existing order of society, the existing world. And socialism just ends up meaning a kind of accommodation to the world as it exists, a defense of the world as it exists, a defense of the state. So it's it's a difficult topic to address, and part of my interest in this project is in informing myself about even more about the tradition, which I've been studying for quite a long time now. But privately, I wanted to kind of conduct this self-education publicly in a way that others could benefit from it as well. People that are interested enough to find this, my recordings and my various postings on social media websites. But I also wanted to improve my ability to communicate these ideas, maybe for a broader audience and not just for people that have this niche interest in this old idea, this old and forgotten idea or misremembered idea. I wanted to improve my ability to communicate and to teach, and it's, especially since the whole pandemic began, there haven't been a whole lot of opportunities to engage people face to face, which is something I do want to do in the near future, or I don't know how near, we'll see, but as soon as it's possible to to have these sorts of public engagements again. But there's I can't ignore how convenient it is to simply press a button on my computer and be talking to a few hundred people. So yeah, I mean, I will probably take more than one pass at answering this question and try to get better and better at doing it, and other similar questions. I guess part of the reason why I find it difficult is because I want it to be difficult. I want the people asking that question to understand that it's difficult to answer, and not to think that what socialism is so easy to summarize, because it's really not. It's really a confusing and complicated history that is invoked when you use that term. And when you give a simple answer, whether it's an answer that I would find, palatable or not, there's better and worse answers. Some people would say, oh, like universal health care. And, not that I'm opposed to universal health care, but that's not socialism. That's just a measure that any state, any capitalist state, can and might take if it becomes politically necessary to do so, to preserve the social order that it rests upon, namely the capitalist social order. A socialist government might need to take that same measure, and probably would, but that doesn't make it a socialist measure. A socialist government would have to, make sure that the trash is collected as well, and that's not socialism. But some people would say it is. Some people would say, oh, you don't like socialism, you don't want the garbage collected. Actually, it's funny because I think the garbage collection in my area is actually privatized. I think, I'm not really sure, actually. I'm a renter, so it's not my problem, thankfully. But anyway, yeah, so I don't know. I was hoping to maybe warm myself up and then take a kind of better stab at that question in this stream. I feel like I'm maybe a little bit too rambly this morning to do that. But we'll see. We'll see how it goes. I still have some time before I need to get on with my day. So I wanted to just read a few short things today. Nothing like the longer essay I read over the last few days. So I'll read these few pieces, and then if there's any time left, we'll see. Let me just adjust the light here. Hold on. So this is a poem by a man named Edwin Markham that was very popular in the old socialist movement around the turn of the 20th century in the United States. It was a favorite of Eugene Debs, and it was very common to find it republished in socialist magazines and newspapers. I don't think Markham himself was a socialist, but I'm not 100% sure about his biography. The poem was, the poem is called "The Man with the Hoe," and it's inspired by a painting by the French painter Jean-Francois Millet, of the same name, in the French translation of that phrase, l'homme à la houe. I don't know if that was close. Pardon my poor pronunciation of French. It's a really powerful poem, and I think it kind of speaks for itself, so I won't ramble on about it anymore. I'll try to include an image of the painting itself in the reposting of this video, but you can find it just by Googling it. So, The Man with the Hoe by Edwin Markham. Bowed by the weight of centuries, he leans upon his hoe and gazes on the ground, the emptiness of ages in his face, and on his back the burden of the world. Who made him dead to rapture and despair? A thing that grieves not and that never hopes. Stolid and stunned, a brother to the ox. Who loosened and let down this brutal jaw? Whose was the hand that slanted back this brow? Whose breath blew out the light within this brain? Is this the thing the Lord God made and gave to have dominion over sea and land? To trace the stars and search the heavens for power? To feel the passion of eternity? Is this the dream he dreamed, who shapes the suns and marked their ways upon the ancient deep? Down all the stretch of hell to its last gulf, there is no shape more terrible than this, more tongued with censure of the world's blind greed, more filled with signs and portents for the soul, more fraught with menace to the universe. What gulfs between him and the seraphim? Slave of the wheel of labor, what to him are Plato and the swing of Pleiades? What the long reaches of the peaks of song, the rift of dawn, the reddening of the rose? Through this dread shape, the suffering ages look. Time's tragedy is in the aching stoop. Through this dread shape, humanity betrayed, plundered, profaned, and disinherited, cries protest to the powers that made the world. A protest that is also a prophecy. O masters, lords, and rulers in all lands, is this the handiwork you give to God? This monstrous thing distorted and soul-quenched? How will you ever straighten up this shape? Touch it again with immortality. Give back the upward-looking and the light. Rebuild in it the music and the dream. Make right the immemorial infamies, perfidious wrongs, immedicable woes. O masters, lords, and rulers in all lands, how will the future reckon with this man? How answer his brute question in that hour when whirlwinds of rebellion shake all shores? How will it be with kingdoms and with kings, with those who shaped him to the thing he is? When this dumb terror shall rise to judge the world, after the silence of the centuries. That was The Man with the Hoe by Edwin Markham, if you're just joining me. Okay, so I began, I think a week or so ago, reading aphorisms from Max Horkheimer's book, Dammerung. I posted a video of the first aphorism. I wanted to go ahead and read a few more. They're short, so we'll just read a couple of them. So this is the second aphorism. It's called monadology. A philosopher once compared the soul to a windowless house. Men relate to each other, talk to each other, deal with each other, persecute each other, yet they do not see each other. But because people have ideas about each other, the philosopher explained them by saying that God had placed an image of the others into the soul of each individual. During the course of life, and in the absence of impressions coming from the outside, this image would develop into a full consciousness of man and the world. But this theory is questionable. It is not my impression that man's knowledge of others comes from God. Instead, I would say that those houses do not have windows, but that they let in only a small and distorted segment of events in the outside world. But this distorting effect is not so much a consequence of the peculiarities of the sense organs, as of the worried or joyful, anxious or aggressive, slavish or superior, sated or yearning, dull or alert psychic attitudes, which constitute that ground of our life against which all other experiences stand out, and which give them their specific quality. Here are two images that might serve as symbols for the degree to which people communicate with each other in capitalist society. Annoyed because it was interrupted while playing with its friends, the child pays a visit to its sick uncle. At the steering wheel of his new convertible, the Prince of Wales drives past an old woman. I know of only one kind of gust that can open the windows of the house wider. Shared suffering. The next aphorism is called roulette. Roulette. Systems are for the little people. The big ones have intuition. They place their bets on the numbers that occur to them. The larger the capital, the better the chances for making up for wrong intuitions. The wealthy will never stop betting because they run out of money, nor hear as they leave that their number is winning now, where they no longer have any money to place on the table. Their intuitions are more dependable than the laborious calculations of the poor, which always fail because they cannot be thoroughly tested. Maybe one more of these. Debased concepts. A scholar of repute who sympathized with socialism heard an unbiased participant in a scientific table conversation speak of humanity. He flushed with noble wrath and took the unsuspecting man to task. Through the worst sort of capitalist practice, which had been used as a cloak for centuries, the concept of humanity had become disreputable and meaningless, he said. Decent people could no longer take it seriously and had stopped using it. A radical scholar, I thought to myself. But, in that case, what terms can still be used for what is good? Because they have been used to camouflage a bad practice, haven't they been just as thoroughly debased as humanity? Some weeks later, a book by this scholar on the reality of Christianity came out. At first I was surprised, but then I discovered that he had not meant the word, but the thing. Okay, one more. This is a good one. Unlimited possibilities. The 20th century is the age of unlimited possibilities. Technological advances occur every day. Abilities which were admired as exceptional just a short time ago are now below average. And human productivity keeps increasing. During the last 100 years, the skills of the worker have developed beyond all expectations, and the average energy, promptness, and endurance of the individual has risen enormously, not only in industry, but everywhere. A degree of virtuosity on the cello, which in earlier days could be achieved only by the greatest artists and which borders on the miraculous today, has become the stock in trade of the conservatory graduate. Not only in sports, but probably also in the writing of verse, the great periods of the past are being outdone. The composer plays ironically with melodies that would have been the highlights of old symphonies. Ford Motor Company turns out 9,000 cars per day, and children navigate them through the traffic of New York. The extraordinary has become commonplace. For centuries, men spoke with horror of Bartholomew's Eve, and the martyrdom of a single individual became a religion. Today, the massacres of St. Bartholomew that imperialism stages, or the heroic courage of the person that resists them, have become daily events which are reported as miscellaneous items in the press. There are so many Socrateses, Thomas Munzers, and Giordano Brunos that their names get lost in the local papers. Today, a single Jesus of Nazareth would barely cause a ripple of annoyance. Jerusalem, on such and such a date, the leader of the revolt we reported on a short time ago was sentenced to death today and executed on the spot. Of course, there are people that shed tears over Sonny Boy at the movies. And they do that at the very moment that, in the service of their own interests, real persons are slowly being tortured to death, simply because they were suspected of fighting for the liberation of mankind. Photography, telegraphy, and the radio have shrunk the world. The populations of the cities witness the misery of the entire earth. One would think that this might prompt them to demand its abolition, but simultaneously, what is close has become the far away. Now, the horror of one's own city is submerged in the general suffering, and people turn their attention to the marital problems. Now the horror of one's own city is submerged in the general suffering, and people turn their attention to the marital problems of movie stars. In every respect, the past is being excelled by the present. I'll pick up with more of these aphorisms, maybe in the next stream or sometime soon. Okay, one more thing I wanted to read today. I posted the text of this a few days ago, or on Halloween actually. But I wanted to read it because it's just so... I think it's just quite remarkable. So I found this published in an issue of The Toiler, which was a socialist newspaper in Terre Haute, Indiana, Eugene Debs' hometown. An issue of that newspaper from December 7th, 1900. It was volume 2, number 44. So I'll just read from the article because it explains what it is in the heading text. So the title of it is "Here's a Corker." The letter below was received this week by Eugene V. Debs and apparently was written by some capitalist politician. There was nothing to show who the writer is, and it is one of the most curious of the many letters received by Mr. Debs. It is, to say the least, a frank expression of the way professional politicians size up the free-voting sovereigns. We would advise workers to keep a copy of this letter next to their heart as an evidence of the love of the politicians for them. Mr. Eugene V. Debs, Sir, sitting here today, thinking of my friends and acquaintances, you came in my mind for a share of my thoughts. I wish to beg you to leave off trying to do anything more with the cattle, for your own good. You surely have learned by this time that you can't control them in a strike or at the polls, so I beg you to sell or abandon them, as did Tom Watson and Jones of Toledo. We can control them by means which you have seen. That is, at the polls, by promises. A little whiskey, cigars, and a few dollars are greater persuaders than all your talk and reason. On a strike, a few clubs and lead soon subdues them to our will. My advice is to leave the herd or sell them, for you cannot make anything but cattle of them. I don't hesitate to tell you that the method that you leaders take to better the conditions of the herd is impracticable. You must see that it is a failure, so I beg you to quit. You can't handle the cattle, for we can stampede them every time you get them rounded up. We control them. Now, if you could put the adhesiveness into them, you could accomplish something. But you cannot. You could elect whom you please and make laws for their relief, but you see they have not sense to act, so it is the survival of the fittest. Now, if you and the other cowboys could handle the cattle on a strike, you could frame your laws, send them to Congress, and demand their passage without debate or action of committee in 5 days. If refused, let every railroad steer quit work, every telegraph operator refuse to touch a key until the bills were passed, and you would get things. But no, you have not the unity of action among yourselves. You demonstrated that in the Chicago strike. Therefore, I have no fear to suggest this to you, so I say again, dispose of your interest in the herd and get out. You have the ability of being something. You have the ability of being something if you will use your energy in the right direction. See how, since the election, we have reduced wages, and they have to stand it. Cold weather is upon the calves. They must provide fuel. But in the spring we expect them to paw up the dirt and gore one another for a while, but a little lead salt will quiet them. We will have the army increased by that time, ready for them, and a great many of the steers will quit this winter and join the army, especially the healthy, restless ones. By that means, we will be rid of them. Negroes and foreign imported cattle will take their place, and we may evade a strike, if not a few shots from the American steers will quiet them. By this time, you certainly see you can only control them in the lodge room, but not in a strike or at the polls. So sell your interest, or give it away, and take your station among men. If there was a Cromwell amongst them, in 24 hours there would be 150,000 of these steers landed in Washington demanding laws, and who could resist them with transportation and communication in their control? But we don't fear that, for they have not the unity nor the sense to know what to do. And don't you know we control the leaders, so you can't act in unison? Look at the 4 presidential aspirants. Suppose they had united on you and put their funds together and presses. You would have compelled us to throw aside the mask and unite the Democratic and Republican parties to hold you in check. But you can't. You can't unite. So I beg you to quit stirring up the herd. It will be better all around. Friend Debs, I would give you my name, but I don't wish to become noted. You would have compelled us to throw aside the mask and unite the Democratic and Republican parties to hold you in check. Okay, I should probably wrap this stream up. Let me just take a quick stab at that question. What is socialism? What is socialism? Well, what most people mean by socialism today is that they want the state to take even more control over society than it already has. They want more regulation of private industry. They want more welfare programs to support people that can't take care of themselves. They want, perhaps if they're even more radical, the government to take over private industries and run them, bureaucratically as state institutions rather than as private companies. They want the government bureaucracy to become even more entrenched as the ruling sector of society, and that simply is not what socialism used to mean at all. In fact, I would say it's the opposite of what it used to mean. But why is it the opposite? Well, today we kind of just treat the state as an immovable object. It's just there. And it could have more control or less control, but it is what it is. The people that control the state, and I don't mean the politicians per se, I mean the bureaucrats, the deep state, if you will, the careerists who occupy the seats from which all the levers of political power can be operated. Sure, we put in politicians to give them different guidance every few years, but the politicians, even where they seem to differ, really basically agree on most things. It's really the details that they're differing over. And the bureaucracy doesn't really need the politicians to give them orders anyway. They can just do what they do. The politicians are just there to make us feel like we have some measure of control over the thing. But it's really a kind of monster, a kind of gigantic octopus that sits astride society with its tentacles, grasping everything and controlling everything to some degree. The old socialist movement, which was defeated and failed and destroyed and disappeared and doesn't exist anymore and hasn't existed for a century, the old socialist movement saw this happening. And they saw this not as the antithesis of capitalism, but as the ultimate and inevitable result of capitalism. Capitalism didn't mean for them free enterprise, free markets, commercial society. It meant the opposite of that. Capitalism was the destruction of free enterprise, the destruction of free markets, the destruction of commerce from within by the growth of monopolies, the growth of giant accumulations of wealth that could have no other competitors than few other giant accumulations of wealth, and that choked out all of the other people in society from competing. Industry after industry was being dominated by these giant monopolistic accumulations that kept growing bigger and bigger and destroying and absorbing their competitors until they dominated the market. And you can see this in all of the major industries now are controlled by a handful of gigantic corporations that may compete with each other on the surface, but of course are fundamentally kind of coordinating with each other at some level. And that doesn't necessarily have to be some sort of conspiratorial prospect, although there very well may be such conspiracies. You know, at the end of the day, when all you have is two or three other giant companies sharing your market share, or sharing the space of the market with you, coordination is inevitable because, of course, you know how your competitor is going to react, and of course you're going to conduct yourself accordingly based on that knowledge. And then, of course, as these giant monopolies grow, the state gets more and more involved, regulates them, and regulates the markets in which they operate. But the state is controlled by the wealthy interests that own these corporations. It's really the wealthy regulating themselves. And the bureaucracy serves their interests. Now, of course, if you're an owner of one of these companies, you may want to make higher profits and pay less taxes and have less regulation to worry about. But those taxes and those regulations are ultimately in your interest, even if they frustrate you, because they exist to keep the social order that makes you wealthy in operation. Socialism was the idea that the working people, the people that lost the opportunity to compete as owners of their own means of life, owners of their own means to produce and sell goods and live by that means. That working people who had no other choice but to find a job where they could, or starve, or resort to crime, or poverty and charity to get by. It was the notion that working people should take control. They should take control of the state, and they should take control of these giant monopolistic accumulations of capital, and operate the whole ensemble in their interests. They should oversee the development of industry in their interests, to reduce the burden of labor, to increase their opportunities to pursue the things that made life worth living. Okay, that's not a great answer, but it was a stab. I'm gonna have to come back to that and keep thinking through that and try to get more concise and more precise. And yeah, but I think that gets at an important part of it. Okay, I need to get ready for work. If you have sat through this rambling and disjointed video, then that's great. If you didn't have the patience for it, I understand. I'll probably cut out some of those things I read and make, just standalone videos of them. But yeah, it's nice to kind of think out loud a little bit, instead of having to restrict myself to these very condensed and precise little pieces of writing that, I don't know how many people read that. I certainly like listening to people talk, and I listen to a lot of podcasts and things like that, and watch a lot of YouTube videos, but there isn't anything out there along the lines of this subject matter. I know there's a lot of leftist podcasts out there, but I find pretty much all of them to be intolerable, except Shit Platypus Says, which is the podcast of the Platypus Affiliated Society, which is excellent. I highly recommend it, but they only do like one episode a month or so kind of find myself wanting a lot of the time. And, there are recordings of platypus panels and stuff, but most other content, if you will, hate that term, but most other content on the left and produced by socialists and so on is just dreadful and intolerable to me. So I guess I wanted to put something out there that people like me might find interesting and worth listening to while you're killing time, because that's what we must do. Kill time until time kills us. Okay, have a nice day.